Hello, this is Tom Waters of the Dwarf Iris Society. I hope you enjoy this presentation about the miniature dwarf bearded irises. This is a familiar diagram that most of you have probably seen. It indicates the 6 different classes of bearded irises. The miniature dwarfs are the smallest, up to 8 inches tall. Then come the standard dwarfs from 8 to 15 inches tall. And the intermediate, miniature tall bearded, and border bearded all have the height range of 16 inches up to 27 inches. And finally, the tall bearded irises are 27.5 inches or taller. The interesting thing to notice about this grouping is that only the MDBs are considered dwarf irises. The SDBs, IBs, MTBs, and BBs are all considered median irises. And this is true even of the standard dwarf bearded. Even though they have the word dwarf in their name, they are considered median irises, not dwarf irises. This is a kind of confusing situation that arose from a debate in the 1950s about whether the SDB, standard dwarf bearded irises, should really be considered dwarfs or not. And this is how it was resolved. The subtitle of this talk is The 3 Types of Miniature Dwarf Bearded Irises. And to understand that breakdown, we need to look at the ancestry of different kinds of dwarfs. This slide shows the type of cross that people were making in the 1950s. And Iris pumila, which you see in the center there, is a very, very small dwarf species that grows in Europe and parts of Western Asia, and had recently become available to iris breeders in the U.S. So they crossed Iris pumila with tall bearded irises, and this produced the type of iris that we now call an SDB, a standard dwarf bearded. The one that's pictured here is Greenspot, which was one of the very first SDBs to be introduced back in 1952 by Paul Cook. And at the time, the SDB class did not exist, so it was registered as an intermediate. But it's a good prototype example of what the SDB irises are like. So that explains where SDBs come from, but what about MDBs, which is the subject of this talk? Well, there are basically 3 ways that miniature dwarfs, MDBs, are produced these days. The most common way is to simply cross 2 SDBs with each other, and sometimes that will produce an iris that's below the 8-inch height limit and is classified as an MDB. Most of the time, crossing SDBs with each other will just produce more SDBs. The second thing you can do is cross an SDB back to the species Iris pumila, and this will almost always give a plant in the MDB height range. And these are what I'm calling type 2. Finally, you can cross Iris pumila with other forms of the same species, and this will also produce a plant in the MDB height range, but one from pure Iris pumila breeding, no other types of irises involved at all. So these can be registered as MDBs, or these days they can also be registered in the species class because they derive entirely from just one species, Iris pumila, and I'm referring to these as type 3. You might ask how you would know when you see an MDB for sale which of these 3 types it belongs to. And unfortunately, the only way to do that is to look at the parentage of the iris. These terms are my own, these type categories. Hybridizers and sellers do not use them. So a little bit of research is required. Let's look first at the type 1 MDBs. Now recall these come from pure SDB breeding. They come from crossing SDBs with other SDBs. These are half pumila and half tall bearded. They are mostly unplanned, by which I mean that the cross is usually made with the idea of producing more SDBs, and the MDBs sort of appear by accident amongst the seedlings of that cross. Since about 1990, almost all MDBs that are being registered and introduced are of this type. They do have a very wide array of color and pattern. This is the only type of MDB where you will see the full range of patterns that you see in the tall bearded irises, including pink and orange and tangerine beards, plicatas, luminatas, and such. They also tend to have the most modern form, by which we mean width and ruffling of the petals. And they are the most adaptable to mild winter climates. And I've said here, just as a kind of rough guess, perhaps zones 4 through 8. All the zone recommendations in this talk are very approximate and shouldn't be taken too literally. Anyone in any zone should try different kinds of MDBs and just see how they do. Most do pretty well in a wide variety of climates. An issue with this type of MDB is that they can grow out of class. Remember, since they are really coming straight out of SDB breeding with nothing else involved, they tend to grow like SDBs. And even if they don't reach the 8-inch height limit in the hybridizer's garden, they may in some other gardens, or depending on climate. So that's a thing to watch for. They tend to bloom late, again because they are pure SDBs. They tend to bloom at the same time as the SDBs. And early bloom is one of the desirable traits of the miniature dwarfs. So it's unfortunate for this type that they can bloom at the same time as the SDBs and sort of get lost amongst their larger relations. There's another problem, since they do come from SDB breeding. It can sometimes happen that they have flowers or foliage that are coarse, by which I mean out of proportion to their height. The height may indeed be 7 or 7.5 inches, but if the flower or leaves are the size that you would find on a regular 12-inch SDB, the plant can look out of proportion. Here's some pictures of MDBs of this type. Icon from Keppel, Kino from Johnson. Note that both of these have tangerine beards, and Icon has orange color in the petals, and those are both characteristics of the type 1. Pearly Whites from Paul Black, you can see the ruffling there, and again the tangerine beards. Beetlejuice from Paul Black, a plicata, another pattern that you see in the type 1 SDBs, the type 1 MDBs and SDBs. African Wine by Kasperick, Dollop of Cream by Black. Tiny Titan, Aitken, notice again the orangey color. Gecko Echo by Kasperick. Now moving on to the type 2 MDBs. Remember, these result from crossing SDBs back to the species Iris pumila. So they are 3/4 pumila and 1/4 tall bearded. The classic MDBs of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were of this type. During that time period, this was the cross that was usually done to create MDBs, and it was thought to produce the best results. The color and pattern are mostly similar to Iris pumila. You don't get those distinctive tall bearded colors and patterns that you see in the type 1s. But Iris pumila itself has a lot of variety. The base color can be white, yellow, cream, blue, purple, violet, and so on. And most of them do have a spot pattern, which is a darker patch in the falls. They generally have tailored form, not much ruffling in this type, but you do have a variety of petal width and form, so flaring form is possible, and they can be quite interesting in their variety. The winter adaptability of these, I would say, is intermediate. I estimate zones 3 to 7 as being good for this type. They almost always stay in class. There's never an issue of these growing up too tall for the MDB category. And they do bloom early. Almost all of them bloom distinctively earlier than the standard dwarfs, so you do get to see them early on in the spring before much else is in bloom. They can be infertile or only partly fertile, which is annoying for hybridizers, although most gardeners would not care about that. Here's Alpine Lake from Wellot in 1980, one of my favorites. The blue coloring on the falls is quite variable. Sometimes it's dark, sometimes it's almost non-existent because it's so pale, and it can be streaky and things as well. Bee Wings from Brown, Black Stallion, Blue Beret. Notice we're going back to 1967 on that one. Still a very attractive iris though. Crown of Snow from Wellot. This is a good example of the spot pattern. You can see the dark violet spot on the falls of this iris, which is in very dramatic contrast with the white standards and the rim around the spot. Pintail from Casper, 2006. Notice the nice reddish color. Pussy Toes from Wellot. And Wee Dragons, a very recent one from Linda Miller. Also, again, they're a very nice red color. And one of my favorites, a classic, Zipper from David Sint in 1979. Clear, deep yellow petals and blue-violet beards that really pop out. And finally, April Ballet from Cleo Palmer, also 1970s. Now, what about the type 3 MDBs? Recall that these are purely Iris pumila. And that can be achieved in several ways. They can actually be plants that are collected in the wild or grown from wild collected seed, or they can be advanced generation garden hybrids. People have been growing Iris pumila now for many decades, and many cultivars have been introduced, and people have continued to breed those and select for what they consider improved color, form, or distinctiveness. They're relatively uncommon compared with the other types. Even in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, when Iris pumila was being grown and used in hybridizing the most, they were less frequent than other types of MDBs. And we've discussed the color range earlier in the last category. Iris pumila has all these white, yellow, blue, purple colors and the distinctive spot pattern. The form is always tailored. You don't see ruffling in this species. But it does have a variety of forms. In some, the falls sort of curve under or tuck, and in others they flare out horizontally, and the edges sort of roll up to make a point at the end, so that looking down from above they look sort of like triangles or stars. This is the form that for a long time hybridizers considered to be the most desirable because it presents the largest surface area and color to someone who's looking down on the plant from above, which is almost always the case with irises this small. They are the most adaptable to cold winter climates. Iris pumila itself comes from high elevation areas in Europe, and so it's quite used to cold winters. I estimate zones 2 to 6 as being the best for it. They do have a problem in mild winter areas because they actually require that winter cold in order to bloom and to thrive. And they are certainly the tiniest and earliest of the dwarfs. 3 to 6 inches is a typical height range, and they bloom even earlier than the type 2 MDBs. In my garden, Iris pumila begins blooming toward the end of March, the last week or two of March, which is a full 2 months before tall bearded season, and 3 or 4 weeks before the SDBs. And this is a great species for hybridizing, not only for miniature dwarfs, but for all sorts of other crosses. And as I mentioned earlier today, some of these are registered in the species category rather than as MDBs. That's entirely the hybridizer's choice. There's not necessarily any difference between one that's registered as a species and one that's registered as an MDB. Here's Bitsy Blue from Linda Miller. Notice the nice light blue spot pattern, and notice that tendency to flare and to roll to a point, which I discussed in the last slide. Hidden Dragon is from Tankersley Clark in 2003. This is one of the ones that was registered in the species class. Hobbit from Miller. Again, nice example of that flaring and rolling form, and very nice color on this one. Light blue with a darker blue spot. And here's Royal Wonder, which is quite a vigorous and attractive, richly colored purple pumila with a nice big bushy blue-violet beard and a somewhat darker spot area. Sudden Butterflies is another one that was registered in the species class, although it was derived from crossing other garden iris pumila MDBs. Suslik is one that was raised from wild collected seed, and it was registered in the species class. The seed came from the Caucasus Mountains, and that's true of several of the other ones that we'll be seeing in a Little Drummer Boy is another wonderful example of the spot pattern and the flaring form. This won the Caparn Welch Medal in 2005. It was one of only 4 of these Type 3 Iris Pumila MDBs to win that award, and it was the most recent of those 4. Wild Whispers is a deep indigo colored Iris Pumila, again raised from seed collected in the wild in the Caucasus. Another very vigorous plant that clumps up well and makes quite a show in the spring. Lesser Goldfinch is another one that was registered in the species category. Notice the light and interesting spot pattern on those falls and the rich yellow color of the petals. And Snips from Linda Miller. Nice red color on that one, contrasting beards and a little deeper spot. This is one of the parents of Wee Dragons, the Type 2 that we saw earlier. So, thank you for your attention. Here's a list of our photographers that have generously contributed photos for the use of the Dwarf Iris Society. We appreciate their work. And finally, I'd like to make a pitch to get more people involved in our society. This is the website address. You can go there and see all sorts of pictures of MDBs and read all sorts of informative articles about them, and even participate in some of our other activities like an annual plant sale and seed sale. Thank you very much.